Darkcast Network, bringing our indie podcasts out of the shadows. Trigger warning, this episode talks about crimes against children, so listener discretion is advised. 10-year-old Andrea Hedger lived in a flat at 30 Balliol Street, which is a 24-minute walk northwest of Glasgow city centre, with her dad, mum Margaret, and 3 brothers aged 14, 7 and 3. Andrea was a particular fan of the TV show The Avengers, which starred Joanna Lumley, who made the Purdy haircut fashionable, which some described as looking like a mushroom or pudding bowl haircut. But Andrea loved it, and wanting to emulate her favourite character on The Avengers, she also got a Purdy haircut, which she was particularly proud of. Andrea was described as being a happy, intelligent and shy little girl who loved school and was particularly well thought of by her teachers and had been very well behaved in and out of school. On Wednesday the 5th of April 1978, the Hedger family had slept in, and so Andrea had left the family home that day at a slightly later time of 9:20 a.m. in possession of a note from her mother Margaret to inform Andrea's school teachers why she was late. She then walked by herself in the direction of her school, which was Willowbank Primary School, and it was located a mere 6-minute walk away. Presumably the rest of the Hedger family went about their day, possibly rather rushed, having been set back by sleeping in. However, when Andrea hadn't returned home from school as normal, her mother called the school to find out what the delay was, only to find out that Andrea had not attended school at all that day. No, that couldn't be right, she would have thought. They must be mistaken. But sadly, no, they weren't mistaken. And so the police were called, upon which a major investigation was launched, and searches were undertaken of back gardens, basements, alleyways, and any empty properties in the area. This search area widened upon Andrea not being found, with police frogmen also searching the nearby Kelvin River, just in case Andrea had somehow made her way there and fallen in. The large Kelvin Grove Park, located close to the Kelvin River, was also searched, and homeowners in the West End of Glasgow were asked to check their basements and outbuildings. Andrea's family were distraught, but the police, while they too were very concerned for Andrea's safety, were still holding out hope that she would be found alive. The police had also made appeals to the public for information about Andrea's whereabouts or of any sightings of her, and there had been a good response, and 2 unconfirmed sightings of Andrea were being looked into. The first possible sighting had been about 12:45 p.m. on a bus heading into Glasgow. She had been sitting alone, and when the bus driver had asked the little girl where she was going, another female passenger had said she would take the girl home for tea. Obviously, the police were keen to speak to the bus driver, the passenger who said she would take the wee girl home for tea, and anyone else who happened to be on this bus at the time who could give them any further information. Another possible sighting of Andrea came from a woman who said she thought she had seen Andrea near a garage in Woodlands Road, which was the road that Andrea would have walked along on her way to her school, so very close to her home. The witness said it had been between 5 and 6 p.m. when she saw this sighting. So, if it were Andrea that had been seen on the bus heading to Glasgow, why wouldn't she have gone to school? As we know, she loved school, and it was not in her character to play truant. It just didn't make sense. If it had been Andrea who had been seen on Woodlands Road between 5 and 6 p.m, where had she been all day, and why did she not go home then? That didn't make sense either. Now, despite the public being in shock and being desperate to help find Andrea, despite the possible sightings of Andrea, despite the police having had a good response from the public, despite the search area being extended, despite more than 1,000 people being interviewed, and despite there being more than 200 officers and 60 detectives involved in this investigation, the police were no further forward in finding out where Andrea Hedger was. That was until Saturday the 8th of April, 3 days after Andrea had happily left her home at 9:20 a.m. to head to school, when, after a smell of her decomposing body was reported, Andrea's body was found by police officers in a basement of a derelict building on Ashley Street, which was a 2-minute walk away from Andrea's home, a distance of 200 yards or 183 metres. And yes, this basement had already been searched twice by police officers and police dogs. However, Andrea's body was so well hidden, being found covered with timber, rubble, and a giant piece of cardboard laying on an old mattress, that she had gone unnoticed. A detective working on the case told the Sunday People newspaper, following emerging from the basement where Andrea's body was found, that it is a foul murder. This was devastating news for Andrea's family, of course, with Andrea's mum and dad both being sedated following Andrea's body being found, but also for the local community, who were appalled that it appeared it wasn't safe for a child to walk to school alone, and terrified it could be their child that was murdered next, and the police officers and detectives who had thrown everything into finding Andrea, hopefully still alive. Following a post-mortem of Andrea's body, it revealed that Andrea had been raped and strangled to death with her own scarf. While detectives and police officers now concentrated everything on finding the killer of 10-year-old Andrea, Andrea's family had to face burying their beautiful daughter. And so, on Friday the 14th of April, Andrea's tiny coffin was driven the 6 minutes to Wellington Church, escorted by a police motorcycle, and with the streets being silently lined from her home to the church by those paying their respects. Following a service, Andrea was then taken to the Western Necropolis, where she was laid to rest. And according to an article from Hidden Scotland, patrolmen were posted on every corner of the route from the church to the cemetery. Following Andrea's touching funeral, all eyes were then turned to the detectives and their investigation, as everyone wanted 10-year-old Andrea's murderer brought to justice. The police, however, were not making as much progress in their investigation into Andrea's killer as they would have liked, and they felt it could partly be to do with the area Andrea and her family lived in. While the Hedger family and many who lived in this area were respectable, decent and law-abiding, the area, especially around Ashley Street where Andrea's body had been found, was known, according to an article on Hidden Glasgow, as a red light area, where unscrupulous landlords let out run-down rooms and flats to sex workers, with their clients visiting at all hours. And many undesirables also lived in the flats in this area, with it being reported in the Press and Journal newspaper on the 8th of April 1978 that a 9-year-old girl who lived in the area had been sexually assaulted 2 weeks prior, although it wasn't known if the cases were linked. The same article also reported that the detective leading the investigation had stated that there were reports of attacks and men exposing themselves in the area surrounding Andrea's home almost every week, with a mother of 5 who lived in the area telling a reporter that men would regularly knock on her door at night thinking it was a brothel. A lot of the properties were also derelict and unoccupied, which obviously was the case for the property where Andrea's body had been found, and this also attracted drifters and those not so law-abiding. It was also reported in the Evening Express newspaper on the 11th of April 1978 that there were many different nationalities living in the area where Andrea's family lived, with the police believing that some people may be reluctant to come forward and report any child being accosted or approached for fear this would bring disgrace to them. So, for these reasons, the detectives were finding it very difficult to find witnesses or glean much information that could point to who Andrea's killer may have been. However, the lead detective refused to give up and said in the same article that "We will speak to the parents of anybody, regardless of nationality, in the utmost confidence." And speak they did, with the police taking around 2,000 statements during the course of the investigation. Despite all the statements taken, though, it would be the theft of some lead from a property in Ashley Street that would eventually lead to Andrea's murderer coming to the attention of the police. Robert Tervet came from a large family, being one of 11 children. In 1978, he was 19 years old, unemployed, had 11 previous convictions, was living rough around the area where Andrea lived, and his 15-year-old girlfriend was pregnant. And according to an article in the Glasgow Evening Times, he was of low intelligence and had a personality disorder. Having come to the police's attention following being caught stealing lead from a property in the area where Andrea lived, and following the investigation into Andrea's murder closing in on him being revealed as the murderer, Robert Tervet fled Glasgow and went to stay with relatives in Manchester in England. On the 25th of April 1978, 20 days after Andrea Hedger had gone missing, Robert Tervet was arrested about 7 miles or 11 kilometres away from his relative's home in Manchester and brought back to Glasgow, where his clothes were taken away to be forensically examined before he was questioned. Initially, upon being questioned about Andrea's murder, he denied being involved and gave an alibi. However, this alibi was quickly undermined, and it didn't take him long to admit that he was, in fact, Andrea's murderer. He told how on the morning of the 5th of April, he had had a fight with his pregnant girlfriend and had been standing on the street Andrea would have been walking down to go to school, crying. He said that apparently Andrea had stopped and asked him what was wrong, apparently saying, "Why is a big man like you crying?" He said he then led Andrea to the basement of the flat at Ashley Street, where he raped and strangled her. If this account is true, then Andrea had been murdered for being kind and caring about seeing someone crying. On the 16th of June, Robert Tervet appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court, where there was a large police presence as hundreds of people had turned up to shout abuse at Andrea's murderer and show him just how angry and disgusted they were. When Robert Tervet made it inside the court, he admitted that he had raped and murdered Andrea Hedger, saying that his attack on Andrea had been his way of getting rid of his anger over his fight with his girlfriend. He was then taken back to Barlinnie prison to await his sentence. Not long afterwards, Robert Tervet appeared at the High Court in Edinburgh, where he was given a life sentence for murdering Andrea and a further 10 years for raping her, as well as a year for the theft of the lead. Now, just before the judge had passed sentence, he had said to Robert Tervet, "It may be that you will suffer in prison for the nature of your crime, but having regard to the nature of that crime, I can feel no sorrow for any treatment to which you may be subjected to." This statement attracted some criticism from prison reform organisations, as they felt the judge had put Robert Tervet's life in danger in prison. Robert was then taken back to Barlinnie prison to begin his sentence. Due to the nature of his crimes and the fear of being attacked by his fellow prisoners, Robert Tervet was kept in solitary confinement, and according to an article in the Herald newspaper on the 7th of July 2017, he was even afraid to take his allotted half-hour of exercise daily for fear of being attacked. Robert Tervet didn't spend his whole sentence in Barlinnie prison. He was later moved to a prison in Liverpool in England, and then to an open prison in Gloucestershire in the south of England, before being paroled in 1997, following spending 19 years behind bars. Back in 1997, there really wasn't a system in place that could continue to monitor people like Robert Tervet once they were released into the community. And so once prisoners were moved to prisons in different parts of the country, the local police forces were unaware of just who was being released into their areas. However, Detective Sergeant Brian McLaughlin, who had been responsible for not only the searches in Andrea's area at the time of her murder, but also in finally arresting Robert Tervet for Andrea's murder, had never forgotten what Robert Tervet had done and had kept an eye on him as he made his way through the system. And Brian McLaughlin had been aware of Robert Tervet's impending release in 1997 and felt it his duty to inform the local police in Gloucestershire of just who Robert Tervet was and when he would be getting released. Until then, the local police had absolutely no idea of Robert Tervet's past. In an interview in 2020 with the Glasgow Evening Times, Brian McLaughlin, who was 75 and retired then, said he had no idea if Robert Tervet had reoffended or if he was likely to reoffend since being released, adding that he didn't even know if he was still alive. What always stuck with Brian was the fact that Robert Tervet had never shown any remorse for what he had done to Andrea. He only displayed self-pity. The area where Andrea had grown up and been brutally murdered was eventually cleaned up, and landlords were forced to improve the conditions of the properties there after a campaign was launched that forced authorities to act. And that's the end of the story. However, it's not quite the end of the episode, as it's now time for
Dawn's Digest.
We hope you had a fantastic holiday season and new year, and have enjoyed our first episode of 2023. As it's a new year, we thought we'd include something a bit different to each episode, where we could tell our listeners more of what we're up to and also find out what our listeners have been up to. So at the end of each episode, there will be a different Dawn's Digest, where I'll share things like the kind reviews that you lovely listeners have left for us. For example, thank you to B. Kimera for leaving us this great review. Excellent storytelling, wonderful voices, well researched. One of my favourites. Much love from a California Uckert. Thanks again, B. We really appreciate your review. Or I'll give a shout out to any new patrons we may have, which reminds me, we've now launched a Scottish Murders Patreon. If you'd like to support the show, you can find our Patreon at patreon.com/scottishmurders, where you'll find 3 tiers you can choose from that have various perks. I'll also shout out anybody that has bought us a coffee at ko-fi.com/scottishmurders or at buymeacoffee.com/scottishmurders. For example, thank you so much to Misty Dawn Wise, who has donated to the show on Ko-fi and left the message, "Get your gran and yourself some socks." Thanks, Misty Dawn Wise. We'll definitely be getting ourselves some socks. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. I'll also let you know what is coming up for Scottish Murders, what we're working on, any previous episode updates, any events we plan on attending, and anything else that pops up. Also, feel free to let us know of any events that you are planning to attend, or if there are any special occasions coming up in your life that you'd like to let us know about, so we can share in a future Dawn's Digest. You can do this by emailing us at contact@scottishmurders.com or on Twitter at twitter.com/scottishmurders, on Instagram at instagram.com/scottishmurderspodcast, or on facebook.com/scottishmurders, MURDURS. We hope you enjoy the edition of Dawn's Digest, and we look forward to hearing from you and shouting you out in some way in the future. Thank you for all your support over the last year and a half. And don't forget to listen for Dawn's Digest at the end of each episode so you don't miss a thing.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Toan.